All right, so we're taking a deep dive today into something pretty wild. We're looking at the South Korean impeachment trial of President Yoon Seong-yeol.
Oh, yeah, this one's a doozy.
It really is. And things have taken a very strange turn. So remember how the Democratic Party was pushing that whole insurrection narrative?
Yeah, like Yoon was trying to pull off a coup.
Exactly.
Okay.
Guess what? They just dropped that charge at the Constitutional Court.
Wow. You're kidding.
Nope. No kidding. So that's what we're digging into today, trying to figure out why they'd back down from what seemed like their strongest accusation.
It's a head scratcher for sure. Like they were all over this insurrection angle for weeks and weeks, and now gone.
Yeah, it does feel a little bit like a bait and switch. So to get into all this, you sent over some really interesting sources.
Yeah, I did.
And I think to understand what's going on here, we need to go back to the beginning, to when this whole thing started.
Right. Okay, so the Democratic Party's initial argument for impeachment, it rested pretty heavily on this idea that President Yoon's declaration of martial law was, like, in their view, a straight-up act of insurrection.
Okay.
They were really trying to paint this picture of him trying to completely overthrow the constitutional order, the whole thing.
And they weren't exactly subtle about it either. Like, I remember seeing all these headlines, insurrection ringleader, subverting the Constitution. It was intense.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But here's where it gets interesting. When you actually look at the legal definition of insurrection in the South Korean Criminal Code,
Okay.
well, things get a bit more complicated.
How so?
So it defines insurrection very specifically, as in a violent uprising that's directly aimed at, like taking over or overthrowing state territory or the constitutional order.
So it's not just about disagreeing with the government or protesting.
No, it's got to be more than that. It has to involve actual violence, a real attempt to physically take control. And that's where it gets tricky for the Democratic Party, because even though, sure, President Yoon's actions were definitely controversial,
Right.
the sources all point out that there wasn't really evidence of an actual violent uprising. Like, there was no armed takeover, no forceful seizure of anything.
Interesting. So legally speaking, calling it an insurrection was always a bit iffy.
It seems that way, yeah. And that makes their decision to just drop it even more puzzling. It's not like they didn't know the legal definition.
Right.
So why push this narrative so hard for weeks and then just completely abandon it later? It's strange.
Yeah, it feels like a classic overselling situation.
Yeah.
Hype it up, get everyone riled up, and then just quietly back down when it's time to actually, prove it.
It definitely raises some questions about their strategy. And honestly, their credibility, too.
Right.
The sources I looked at, a lot of them were worried about this eroding public trust, not just in the Democratic Party, but in the whole impeachment process itself.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Like, if they're willing to just throw around a serious accusation like that without a solid legal basis, what does that say about, their commitment to the facts, to due process?
It kind of casts a shadow over everything, And it really makes you wonder about their motivations. Like, was this some calculated political move? Or did they just totally misjudge how strong their case was?
It could be a bit of both, right?
Yeah.
And that's what makes this whole thing so interesting. The sources offer a few possible explanations. So one theory is that they're trying to streamline the case, like to get a faster verdict.
Interesting.
So by dropping the insurrection charge, they can just focus all their energy on the martial law declaration itself. Was it constitutional or not?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Which, honestly, might be easier for them to prove.
Yeah, a speedier trial could definitely work in their favor. Especially with all the other political stuff going on.
Exactly. A successful impeachment, even if it's on, narrower grounds, it could really shake things up and potentially benefit certain people within the Democratic Party.
Yeah, this is all happening with, a million other political battles and power struggles as the background.
Oh, absolutely. It's a total mess.
Total mess.
And that brings us to another possibility. It's a bit more out there. But some of the sources suggested that the Democratic Party might have been pressured to drop the insurrection charge.
Pressured by who? Wait, are you saying the Constitutional Court itself?
Now, hold on. We're getting into speculation territory here, so we got to be careful.
Right.
But a good chunk of the sources pointed to this idea of potential interference as a major red flag. Like, if that's true, it raises some serious questions about how impartial the court really is and, the fairness of the entire trial.
That's a huge claim. Is there anything concrete in the sources to back that up?
Well, it's mostly based on like observations about the court's actions and statements and the timing of the Democratic Party's decision. Some people are arguing that the court might have signaled, maybe not directly, but hinted that the insurrection charge was a long shot.
Hmm. So the Democratic Party, realizing they were fighting a losing battle, decided to cut their losses
Yeah,
and refocus.
that's one way to look at it, yeah. But it is just one interpretation.
Fair enough.
Right.
But even if we don't think about the Kurt's involvement, this whole insurrection thing still raises some red flags.
Oh, for sure. By pushing such a huge accusation and then just dropping it, the Democratic Party might have suddenly damaged public trust in the whole impeachment process.
Right. People might start seeing it as just a political tool, like a way to score points, instead of a genuine attempt to hold a president accountable.
Exactly. It's almost like they cried wolf, and now nobody's going to believe them the next time they try to make a serious accusation.
That's a scary thought. And that could have some serious long-term consequences for South Korean democracy, right?
Yeah, definitely. Like, how stable is it? How legitimate is it if this kind of stuff keeps happening?
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the legal stuff, the political motivations, and even, the possibility of interference from the court.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. But one thing is clear. This insurrection charge, it wasn't just some small procedural thing. This decision to drop it has huge implications for this whole trial and for South Korean politics as a whole.
Right. It really highlights that tension between holding leaders accountable and making sure the process is fair. It's a delicate balance. And the stakes are, incredibly high.
Okay, so we've spent all this time talking about this whole insurrection charge and how the Democratic Party just kind of dropped it. Feels like a pretty big shift,
Yeah, it's definitely a turning point. It makes you think about not just the law, but also, what their plan is and how much people trust all this.
Right. And it kind of leaves us hanging, doesn't it?
Yes.
What happens now? Where does this impeachment trial go from here?
That's what makes this whole thing so fascinating. So now that they've gotten rid of the insurrection part, it really narrows things down, right?
Yeah.
It's not about Yoon's intentions or whether he was planning some big power grab. It's all about martial law. Did he overstep his boundaries when he declared it?
So it's less about the big picture and more about the specifics of the law.
Exactly. And that could be good or bad for the Democratic Party. On the one hand, their argument's way simpler now.
Right.
They just got to convince the court that, boom, this martial law thing was straight up unconstitutional. He didn't have the power to do it.
Okay, I see.
But the downside, it might be harder to get the public riled up now. That whole insurrection narrative, that was powerful stuff. It's made Yoon sound like a real threat to democracy.
Yeah, it was a lot more dramatic. More like good versus evil.
Exactly. But now it's all about legal technicalities,
Yes.
which honestly can be pretty boring.
Makes you wonder if they planned this all along or if they just realized their insurrection case was too weak.
Who knows? It's hard to say what was going on behind closed doors, but what we can do is look at what might happen next. The sources pointed out some key things to watch for.
All right, so let's break those down. What should we be paying attention to as this trial goes forward?
Well, first off, the legal stuff. How well do each side actually argue their case? Can the Democrats convince the court that the martial law declaration was, a clear violation of the Constitution?
And will Yoon's lawyers be able to, poke holes in their argument, cast some doubt?
Exactly. And remember, we're talking about interpreting the law here. It's not always cut and dry. The court has to consider all these different arguments, precedents,
So it could still go either way, even without the insurrection charge.
Absolutely. And that leads us to the second thing to watch. The court itself.
Okay.
Who are these judges? What are their leanings? Could they be influenced by political pressure? All that stuff could affect the final verdict.
We talked before about that idea of the court maybe pressuring the Democrats to drop the insurrection charge.
Right. And that's definitely something to keep in mind. As we see how the court acts, what they decide, how they handle the whole thing, do they seem neutral, like they're just following the law? Or is there something else going on?
It's a lot of power they have. They're basically deciding the future of the president and, the whole country.
You got that right. And lastly, we can't forget about the public. How do they feel about all this? About the Democrats changing their strategy? About what Yoon did?
Right.
That's going to have a big impact on everything going forward.
Yeah, even if Yoon survives this impeachment, does it damage him? Does he lose credibility? Or does he come out stronger?
Exactly. And how about the Democrats? Will people see them as too aggressive? Or will they be able to, spin this whole thing and focus on the martial law issue?
Wow. So many questions. So much uncertainty. It feels like we're watching a really important moment in South Korea's history. Like, this could change everything.
It definitely could. And that's why it's so important to stay informed, to really talk about all this and think critically about the information that's out there.
Yeah, don't just take everything at face value. Question things, dig deeper, come to your own conclusions.
Because a healthy democracy needs citizens who are engaged, who are informed, and who are willing to hold their leaders accountable.
Well said. And I think the sources we looked at today are a great starting point for that. They offer different perspectives, different arguments. They really make you think. And that's what this deep dive has been all about.
Exactly. Giving our listeners the knowledge and insight they need to understand this complicated world.
We're not here to tell anyone what to think. We just want to spark some curiosity, get people thinking critically, and hopefully help them form their own opinions.
That's the goal.
So as this impeachment trial keeps going, keep what we've talked about today in mind. Don't just read the headlines. Pay attention to the details, the motivations, what it all means for the future of South Korean democracy.
It's a story that's not over yet, and we don't know how it's going to end.
This has been The Deep Dive, your shortcut to being well-informed.